In the ancient text of the Qur'an, in the chapter called Al-Fajr, there is a brief but powerful description of a place known as Iram, the city of the pillars. It is remembered as a settlement of arrogance and splendor, inhabited by a people who believed their greatness unmatched. The words are spare, yet the tone is heavy with warning. The verse recalls a people who were destroyed by divine wrath, leaving behind a mystery that has never ceased to stir imagination. Iram is described as a city whose like had not been created in any other land. Such a description, embedded in sacred scripture, ensured that this place would echo through centuries of storytelling. Legends say its inhabitants were members of the tribe of Ad, a people gifted with prosperity but consumed by pride. In these stories, the Ad defied prophetic warnings and turned away from humility. The punishment that followed was devastating. A violent storm, lasting days upon days, swept away their city, leaving nothing but ruins buried beneath shifting sands. The tale fits a broader rhythm that appears throughout sacred texts, in which arrogance leads to destruction and human defiance is answered by forces beyond control. As centuries passed, the legend deepened. Oral tradition embroidered the stark Quranic verse with details that stretched into myth. The people of Ad were described as giants, beings of enormous stature whose footsteps carved into the desert stone. Their strength was matched only by their hubris. Bedouin storytellers recounted how these giants built Iram with colossal pillars that rose toward the sky, visible across the barren wastes of Arabia. These towers, gleaming in the desert sun, were said to embody a civilization so advanced that it rivaled anything the world had seen. But just as the city reached the height of its glory, it was erased, swallowed by the same desert that had nourished its growth. The motif of giants in ancient storytelling is not unique to Arabia. In the Hebrew scriptures, one finds mention of the Nephilim, mysterious figures of great size who walked the earth before the flood. In Greek myths, the Titans were said to build mighty works before being overthrown by the Olympian gods. The Arab tales of Iram fit into this larger pattern in which humanity remembers the ruins of the past as the handiwork of beings larger than life. To see the remains of massive stone structures, often weathered by centuries of erosion, must have inspired the belief that only giants could have shaped them. Travelers through the Arabian Peninsula carried these tales across deserts and mountains. By the medieval period, chroniclers and poets expanded the legend. They painted images of vast markets filled with treasures, palaces whose ceilings sparkled with gems, and streets lined with pillars carved from stone and marble. In these accounts, Iram became more than a city. It became a symbol, an allegory of human arrogance punished by forces divine and natural. Over time, it came to be known as the Atlantis of the Sands, a name that reveals how the legend was woven into global imaginations. Just as Plato had spoken of a great island lost beneath the sea, Arab storytellers spoke of a magnificent city erased by sandstorms. The desert itself encouraged such imagination. The Rub al Khali, or empty quarter, stretches over hundreds of thousands of square kilometers. It is one of the harshest deserts on Earth, where dunes rise like waves of an ocean frozen in time. In such a place, the thought that a great city might lie hidden beneath the dunes is not far-fetched. Shifting sands conceal and reveal with equal ease, making disappearance seem natural. Caravans that lost their way told of seeing towers in the distance, mirages perhaps, or the tops of buried structures. Some swore they had stumbled upon strange stone foundations in valleys of silence, remnants of the lost city. Yet even as legends spread, skepticism endured. Scholars debated whether Iram had been an actual city or merely a symbol. The Qur'an itself does not provide geographic coordinates or elaborate details, and many commentators interpreted Iram as a metaphor for human arrogance rather than a place to be mapped. But others believed firmly in its reality. For them, Iram was as real as the vanished tribes described in ancient texts, waiting to be rediscovered. The persistence of these stories ensured that European explorers who entered Arabia centuries later were already primed to search for the lost city. When they heard Bedouin guides whisper about ruins covered by the sands, they linked the tales with Plato's Atlantis and the biblical cities destroyed for their sins. The 19th and 20th centuries brought an intensification of this search, fueled by the idea that hidden beneath the dunes lay a civilization that had rivaled Babylon or Petra. But before any satellite images or archaeological surveys, before any maps drawn by European adventurers, there was the legend. The legend of Iram had lived for over a millennium in the stories of desert tribes. Around their campfires, as stars wheeled across the Arabian sky, they recounted how the giants of the Ad had built pillars so high they seemed to touch the heavens. They told of the prophet Hud, who warned his people to abandon their arrogance. They told of the storm, unrelenting, sweeping across the desert with such force that it buried the towers forever. These stories carried a rhythm that was both cautionary and awe-inspiring. To those who heard them, the sands were not just emptiness. They were a veil that hid both treasures and judgments, a reminder that greatness without humility is fleeting. Thus, from sacred verse to folklore to explorers' obsession, the legend of Iram grew into one of the most enduring mysteries of the desert. And so the question lingered: could there truly have been a city that rose in splendor, adorned with pillars only to vanish without trace? Could the storms of the desert erase so completely a settlement once unmatched in its greatness? Or was Iram always a story, a mirror in which generations saw reflected their fears of arrogance and their yearning for lost wonders? The search for truth would not be easy. To pursue it meant entering the vast silence of the empty quarter, a land where heat, sand, and mirage distort both vision and certainty. It is here, in the tension between myth and reality, that the journey begins. Iram may be only a name, or it may be a clue to something buried deep beneath the dunes. The legend endures, not only because of what it promises to reveal, but also because of what it warns against forgetting. And from this legend would emerge a search that still continues, driven by explorers, archaeologists, and dreamers who cannot resist the allure of the Atlantis of the sands. The story of Iram lingers because it bridges the fragile line between memory and imagination. In the ancient world, where the desert could erase entire settlements within a generation, stories were the only way to preserve the existence of a people or a place. Oral tradition does not always preserve fact with precision, but it carries the essence of a memory, an impression of something that once mattered greatly. For the tribes who told and retold the tale of Iram, the legend was not only about ruins hidden beneath the dunes, it was also about the lessons of power, arrogance, and the unstoppable forces of nature that could undo even the greatest human endeavors. When the Qur'an speaks of Iram of the pillars, it situates the story within a pattern familiar to its audience. Communities that believed themselves untouchable, whether they were the people of Ad, the pharaohs of Egypt, or the people of Sodom, were all cast as examples of divine judgment. In this way, Iram was not an isolated story. It was part of a universal message, a reminder that arrogance would eventually be answered, not only in the afterlife, but in the visible fate of entire civilizations. The words are timeless because they speak beyond the sands of Arabia. They touch something human, something that repeats across history. Over centuries, Muslim historians and scholars attempted to anchor the story to real places. Some linked Iram with the southern reaches of Arabia, near the incense trade routes that connected the Arabian Peninsula with Mesopotamia, Egypt, and India. Others imagined it in the north, near the lands of the Thamud, whose rock-carved dwellings can still be seen today in Madain Saleh, in present-day Saudi Arabia. The uncertainty of its location only heightened its mystique. To say with certainty where Iram once stood would have been to rob the legend of its vastness. As long as the location remained unfixed, it could belong to any valley, any shifting dune, any horizon of the Arabian desert. In the minds of those who heard the story, the city was not just stone and mortar, it was also a symbol of lost grandeur. Imagine wandering the desert night, the campfire flickering, and hearing a storyteller describe towers that once pierced the sky. For a traveler staring out at endless sand, such a vision would feel both impossible and strangely believable. The desert does not give much, but it does give space for imagination. Mirages already create the illusion of distant lakes or cities shimmering on the horizon. How easy then to believe that somewhere beyond the dunes lies a city buried and waiting to be uncovered. By the medieval period, the story of Iram had taken on a life beyond Arabia. It appeared in works of literature and folklore, including the 1001 Nights, where ruined cities and cursed palaces appear as common motifs. These tales brought the image of Iram into a wider network of storytelling. To listeners in Persia, India, or North Africa, the legend carried both the aura of Arabia's vast deserts and the universal theme of hubris punished. In this way, Iram joined the ranks of other mythical cities such as the City of Brass, a dazzling metropolis of metal walls and locked gates that appears in Arabic folklore. Yet there is something distinctive about Iram. Unlike the City of Brass or the marvels of the 1001 Nights, Iram is anchored to scripture. It is not purely fantasy. The fact that it is mentioned in the Qur'an lends it an authority that cannot be ignored, even by the most skeptical. Whether interpreted metaphorically or literally, Iram carries weight. It is not a tale invented solely for entertainment. It is a moral lesson tied to a place, real or imagined, that was once recognized by those who first heard the revelation. As European travelers and Orientalist scholars encountered Arabian folklore in the 18th and 19th centuries, they were drawn to Iram as a parallel to Atlantis. The comparison was natural. Both were cities described as wealthy and powerful, brought low by forces greater than themselves, and both had supposedly vanished from the face of the earth. Explorers who crossed Arabia in search of trade routes or scientific knowledge often heard local guides mention ruins in the desert. To a mind already filled with the myth of Atlantis, these scattered stones seemed like clues. The idea of an Arabian Atlantis became irresistible. Newspapers in Europe printed sensational accounts of explorers claiming to have found traces of Iram, though most of these were exaggerations or misunderstandings of ancient ruins that had no direct connection to the story. The desert itself, however, was always the strongest ally of the legend. Unlike temperate lands where ruins remain visible for millennia, the shifting sands of the Rub al Khali can swallow an entire structure in a matter of decades. What is visible one season may vanish in the next. Archaeologists and geographers who ventured into the region noted how easily caravan routes disappeared, erased by dunes that moved like slow rivers. If a city had indeed stood in the empty quarter thousands of years ago, it is not difficult to imagine it being buried completely, awaiting rediscovery by those who know where to look. Even in the modern era, the legend continued to adapt. Bedouin tribes spoke of seeing ancient walls half buried by sand, or hearing of travelers who stumbled upon pillars jutting from the desert floor. These reports were often vague, but they kept alive the belief that Iram was not entirely gone. Some believed that to find it was dangerous, that the city was cursed, its destruction a warning never to be forgotten. Others thought it would bring treasure and renown to those who uncovered it. Either way, the belief ensured that Iram never vanished from collective memory. The legend of Iram endured not because it was simple, but because it was layered. At once, it was a tale of giants, a Quranic warning, an explorer's dream, and a Bedouin fireside story. It was moral lesson and treasure map, metaphor and history entwined. This complexity allowed it to remain relevant across centuries and across cultures. No single interpretation could claim it fully, and so it remained open, adaptable, and alive. As the 20th century began, the stage was set for the legend to move from oral tradition and ancient text into the realm of modern science. The invention of new technologies, from aerial surveys to satellite imaging, offered new ways to probe the desert. If a city had once existed in the empty quarter, perhaps now humanity finally had the tools to uncover it. Yet even as archaeology advanced, the question remained the same. Was Iram a real city waiting to be found, or was it destined to remain a legend, forever serving as a parable of human pride and divine justice? The pursuit of that answer would draw explorers, archaeologists, and scientists deeper into the Arabian desert. Their search would bring both discoveries and debates, for even in the age of science, the legend of Iram resisted easy explanation. It remained suspended between history and myth, half revealed and half concealed, much like the desert itself. The persistence of Iram as a living legend is remarkable, for it reveals not only the resilience of oral traditions, but also the human need to anchor morality in place. A myth without geography drifts, but a myth tied to valleys, dunes, and ruins acquires a texture that feels tangible. When the Qur'an described Iram as the city of the pillars, listeners could imagine not an abstract lesson, but a real city of stone. perhaps a city they had heard about in their ancestors' songs. Over centuries, this association strengthened until storytellers could point to the empty quarter and say that somewhere in those vast reaches of silence, beneath the rolling dunes, lay the proof of what happens when pride blinds a people to humility. Even the name Iram carries echoes that amplify its mystery. Scholars have debated its roots, some connecting it to the name of an ancient tribe, others suggesting that it might be an archaic form of a place name used in southern Arabia. Inscriptions found in old caravan stops sometimes list names that resemble Iram, though never in a way precise enough to settle the question. The lack of certainty has been a gift to the legend, for it has allowed Iram to be many things at once, each interpretation adding another layer to the fabric of the story. For centuries, the tale was retold by Bedouins as they crossed the desert with their herds, or by caravan traders carrying frankincense north to Mesopotamia and west to the Levant. In their retelling, the story of Iram became woven into the very landscape of Arabia. A collapsed wall of stone in the middle of nowhere might be pointed to as a remnant of the lost city. A sudden sandstorm could be described as the same force that once buried a civilization. In this way, legend and landscape became inseparable. To live in the desert was to live in a place haunted by vanished cities. By the time European explorers arrived, the legend had already spread into their imaginations through translations of Islamic texts and tales of Arabian folklore. The desert, which to them appeared as a blank map waiting to be filled, was given life by the idea that beneath its surface lay an Arabian Atlantis. It is no coincidence that when the British adventurer Lawrence of Arabia heard about Iram, he called it the Atlantis of the Sands. He was not merely repeating Arab legends, but fusing them with a European myth of a lost city that symbolized both wonder and downfall. The power of such a parallel was immense. It ensured that Iram would no longer be seen as just a local tale. It became part of a global fascination with civilizations that rise and fall, hidden by oceans or by deserts. Yet the comparison with Atlantis also highlights an important difference. Plato's Atlantis was a philosophical story, a parable about the dangers of greed and overreach, with little evidence to suggest it was meant as literal history. The Quranic reference to Iram, however, is embedded in a religious text and in the memory of people who believed they were preserving real events. To dismiss Iram as pure allegory would be to overlook the fact that in the ancient world, many cities did indeed vanish. Trade routes shifted, rivers dried up, earthquakes toppled walls, and climate change forced migrations. Entire settlements were forgotten until chance or archaeology brought them to light again. In this sense, the idea of a lost city beneath the sands was not implausible. The balance between plausibility and myth is what has given Iram its enduring hold. On the one hand, it fits perfectly into the symbolic rhythm of religious warnings. On the other, the desert is capable of swallowing a city whole. The two reinforce each other. The religious message gives the legend moral force, while the geography provides it with realism. Between the two, listeners across centuries could believe that the City of the Pillars was both a divine example and a historical memory. One of the reasons the legend could never be silenced is because ruins do exist across Arabia that seem to whisper of forgotten greatness. The Nabatean city of Petra, carved into rose-colored cliffs, was unknown to Europeans until the 19th century. The monumental tombs of Mada-in Saleh, with their towering facades, remain as a reminder of the Thamud, another ancient tribe mentioned in the Qur'an. If such spectacular cities could remain hidden for centuries, why not Iram? This was the reasoning that kept the legend alive in both scholarly debate and popular imagination. Each time a ruin was uncovered, hope for Iram's discovery was renewed. The legend was not confined to stories and ruins, it shaped identity. For many in Arabia, Iram became a part of their heritage, a story that linked their deserts with the grandeur of lost civilizations. It was a reminder that Arabia was not only a land of empty sand, but also a place that once stood at the crossroads of global trade, where frankincense and myrrh traveled from southern coasts to empires far away. To speak of Iram was to speak of a time when Arabia was central to the world's wealth and imagination. In the 20th century, as modern states arose and interest in archaeology grew, Iram became more than just a legend of the past. It became a goal for discovery, a mystery that could anchor cultural pride if confirmed. Scholars debated texts, explorers drew maps, and eventually technology entered the search. The promise was that science could succeed where oral tradition and folklore had left only hints. Yet even with all these efforts, the legend remained tantalizingly unresolved. The sands had not yielded their secret, and so the city continued to hover between presence and absence, both real and unreal, waiting for proof. Thus the story of Iram, the city of the pillars, endured from scripture to folklore, from Bedouin campfires to European explorers, from mystical cautionary tale to modern archaeological puzzle. Its survival is not simply because of the details it contains, but because of the questions it raises. Was it a real city that flourished and vanished? Was it a moral lesson clothed in imagery? Or was it both, a memory of a real place elevated into symbol by centuries of retelling? The search for answers would drive explorers and archaeologists into the empty quarter, determined to test legend against evidence. And so the chapter closes as it began, with a tension unresolved. The Qur'an spoke of Iram of the pillars, whose like was not created in the lands. Legend expanded those words into stories of giants, towers, treasures, and divine wrath. Generations retold the tale until it became the Atlantis of the sands, a city half believed, half dreamed. What remains is the question that has haunted deserts for centuries. Could the sands still be hiding the ruins of Iram, waiting for the right moment, the right eye, or the right technology to reveal them once more? In the heart of Arabia, the desert is often thought of as a blank, an endless horizon of dunes where life struggles to survive. Yet history reveals that the sands were not always silent. Long before modern borders and highways, tribes moved across this land, building settlements, carving inscriptions, and creating cultures that left faint traces on stone and memory. The story of Iram does not stand alone. It is woven into the larger history of Arabian peoples, particularly the tribes known as the Ad and the Thamud. To understand the legend of the City of the Pillars, one must first enter the world of these ancient desert kingdoms, for it is within their rise and fall that myth and history begin to merge. The Ad are remembered in the Qur'an as a powerful tribe, blessed with strength but destroyed for their arrogance. They are said to have lived in the southern reaches of Arabia, in lands watered by monsoon rains that once made the region fertile. The Qur'an describes their leader as a figure of immense influence, a man who built monuments and believed that his people could not be surpassed. Prophets warned the Ad to abandon their pride, yet they did not listen. Their fate, as told in scripture, was sealed by a storm that swept away their dwellings. Though their name survives in text, their physical traces are elusive. Scholars have long debated whether they can be linked to archaeological remains in southern Arabia, where ancient settlements once thrived along the incense trade routes. The Thamud, in contrast, left clearer marks upon the earth. They lived further north, in the lands that stretch between present-day Saudi Arabia and Jordan. The Quran describes them as a people who carved dwellings into mountains, secure in their strength but guilty of arrogance. Their story is bound to the Prophet Salih, who called them to righteousness but was ignored. Like the Ad, their destruction was presented as divine judgment. What makes the Thamud remarkable is that their rock-cut dwellings still stand. At Madain Saleh, known to archaeologists as Al-Hijr, monumental tombs rise from sandstone cliffs, their facades carved with precision. These remains are among the most striking in Arabia, evidence that the Thamud were not just legend, but a people of architectural skill. For travelers across the desert, such ruins became anchors for storytelling. When Bedouins saw monumental tombs half buried in sand, it was easy to connect them with Quranic accounts of vanished peoples. The link between oral tradition and physical remains is powerful. Even when scholars argue about precise dates or cultural connections, the imagination of the people who live among the ruins rarely wavers. To them, the Thamud and the Ad were not abstract figures of ancient history. They were real, their fate written in stone, their arrogance punished and preserved as a warning. These tribes did not exist in isolation. They were part of a network of cultures that thrived in Arabia long before Islam. Inscriptions found in the region mention names of rulers, gods, and cities that hint at a vibrant world now largely forgotten. South Arabia in particular was once home to kingdoms such as Sheba, Hadramaut, and Caravan, whose wealth was built on the trade in frankincense and myrrh. These resins, harvested from trees that grew in the Dhofar mountains of Oman and the deserts of Yemen, were prized across the ancient world. Caravans carried them northward, their routes crossing the harsh lands of the empty quarter. In return, Arabian merchants received silver, gold, textiles, and grain from distant lands. The incense trade shaped the settlements of Arabia, and it also shaped the legends. Cities grew near wells and oases, where caravans could rest and resupply. Over time, some of these caravan stops became fortified towns with markets, temples, and towers. When travelers told stories of their journeys, they spoke of cities that seemed to rise from the desert itself, rich from the trade in incense. It is not difficult to imagine how memories of such cities might have been woven into the legend of Iram. The city of the pillars may well have been a cultural echo of the wealthy towns that dotted the caravan routes, towns whose prosperity eventually faded as trade shifted and climates changed. The desert can be deceptive. Where today there is only sand, there may once have been rivers and pastures. Geological studies suggest that parts of Arabia experienced wetter climates in the past, with seasonal rains that supported agriculture and grazing. Such shifts remind us that the desert has not always been as empty as it now appears. Oral tradition may preserve fragments of these earlier landscapes, remembering them as lush valleys where once stood proud cities. When the climate changed and the sands advanced, those places would have been abandoned, their memory surviving only in story. For the people of Arabia, the stories of vanished tribes were more than history. They were moral lessons tied to the land they lived on. To recite the fate of the Ad and the Thamud was to remind listeners that arrogance leads to downfall, that wealth without humility is fleeting, and that even the greatest works of stone can be undone by wind and time. These lessons resonated strongly in a land where survival was fragile, where every oasis was a gift, and every sandstorm a reminder of nature's power. As the legend of Iram grew, it absorbed elements from the stories of these tribes and kingdoms. The people of Ad became giants, the Thamud became master builders, and their cities became models for what Iram must have been. The blending of history and myth created a tapestry that was both moral and mysterious. The ruins of Madain Saleh stood as visible proof that great peoples had indeed perished, and so the possibility that another city lay hidden beneath the sands seemed all the more believable. It is within this context that the search for Iram began to take shape. The desert was not just emptiness, it was a library of ruins, inscriptions, and memories scattered across thousands of kilometers. To follow its clues required more than folklore. It required archaeology, patience, and a willingness to enter landscapes where survival was never guaranteed. The legend of the City of the Pillars was no longer just a story. It had become a question, one that demanded investigation, and as the 20th century approached, explorers and scientists would begin to ask it with new tools, convinced that the sands might still yield their secrets. The memory of the Ad and the Thamud is deeply tied to the way human beings remember landscapes. Unlike written chronicles that preserve dates and details, oral traditions compress centuries into stories that can be told in a single evening. A storm that devastates a village might, after generations of retelling, become the storm that destroyed an entire tribe. A series of droughts that forced migrations might be remembered as divine judgment upon a proud people. These transformations are not fabrications. They are the way memory adapts to endure, preserving meaning when precision fades. In Arabia, where sand constantly shifts and erases traces of the past, story became the strongest form of preservation. When travelers speak of the Ad, they describe them as a tribe unlike any other, a people of immense size and strength who built structures with towering pillars. Archaeologists, however, look for connections in the material record. In the southern regions of Oman and Yemen, ruins of fortified settlements have been uncovered, some dating back thousands of years. These sites reveal that the land was once dotted with villages and towns sustained by trade. Walls and towers suggest both prosperity and the need for defense. Though no inscription has yet been found that explicitly names the Ad, the possibility remains that their memory reflects these real settlements magnified by time into legend. The Thamud present a clearer case. Inscriptions written in their script have been found across northern Arabia, from the deserts of Najd to the cliffs near Petra. These texts are often simple, recording names or prayers, but they prove that the Thamud were a real people, literate and widespread. Their rock-cut dwellings at Madain Saleh stand as undeniable evidence of their architectural skill. What the Qur'an describes as their arrogance may in fact reflect the pride of a people who believed their stone monuments would last forever. That belief, ironically, proved partly true, for their facades still survive, even as their society disappeared. The connection between these historical tribes and the legend of Iram lies in the human tendency to weave separate memories into a single story. If the Thamud could carve palaces from stone and the Ad could build towers that seemed to touch the sky, then surely there must once have been a city that embodied the greatness of both. The idea of Iram as a city of pillars may thus represent the fusion of these memories into a single symbol. This process is not unique to Arabia. Across the world, myths of vanished cities often combine elements of different cultures. The Greek Atlantis, for example, may have drawn inspiration from real disasters such as the eruption of Thera, but it became a composite myth of hubris and loss. Iram functions in much the same way. The trade routes that crossed Arabia provided the stage for these legends to spread. For thousands of years, caravans carried incense from the southern coasts of Arabia northward. These caravans were lifelines of wealth, connecting desert settlements to great empires. Incense was more than a luxury. It was used in temples across Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, and Rome, burned in rituals that linked the human with the divine. The demand was so great that entire kingdoms in Arabia rose and flourished on this trade alone. Towns emerged along the caravan routes, each one dependent on the next, forming chains of supply that stretched across thousands of kilometers. These towns left behind ruins, inscriptions, and faint traces of roads, but much remains buried. The desert hides as much as it reveals. To stand in the Rub al Khali today is to see nothing but rolling dunes, yet beneath the sand lie the ghostly remains of caravan tracks once pressed by the hooves of camels. Archaeologists who have traced these routes through aerial surveys confirm that the empty quarter was not always empty. It was crossed by merchants, guarded by fortresses, and sustained by wells. In the imagination of those who traveled it, the greatest of these settlements could only be described as a city of unparalleled grandeur. The power of trade to shape memory cannot be overstated. When a city grows rich by controlling the flow of incense, it becomes legendary even in its own time. Its markets fill with foreign goods, its temples echo with songs, and its leaders believe themselves invincible. But trade is fragile, routes shift, rival ports emerge, and climates change. Once the caravans turn elsewhere, the city that seemed eternal can collapse in a matter of decades. To later generations, its sudden absence can only be explained by catastrophe, divine wrath, or burial beneath the desert. This is how history blends with myth. Climatic studies suggest that Arabia experienced cycles of wetter and drier periods. During the wetter periods, settlements expanded, supported by seasonal rains that filled wadis and sustained pastures. During the drier periods, these same settlements shrank or were abandoned. It is possible that the Ad and the Thamud lived during times of prosperity, only to see their societies undone by environmental shifts. Their downfall would then be remembered not as gradual decline, but as sudden destruction. In oral tradition, slow change often becomes compressed into a single dramatic event. Thus, the storm that destroyed the Ad or the quake that punished the Thamud may have been symbolic ways of describing long climatic or social processes. By the time Islam emerged in the 7th century, these stories were already ancient. To the listeners of the Qur'an, the mention of Iram and the Thamud resonated with tales they had heard since childhood. These were not abstract myths, but local memories tied to landscapes they knew. They could point to ruins carved in stone or to valleys once green with pasture and say that here in these places lived the peoples who defied prophets and were destroyed. The Quran did not need to provide details. The audience already carried the memory. For modern scholars, this raises a crucial question. When we read of Iram, are we reading about one specific city, or are we reading about the collective memory of Arabia's vanished kingdoms? Perhaps Iram was never a single place, but rather the distilled essence of many places, remembered and retold until it became one name. If so, then the search for Iram is not only about finding ruins beneath the sand. It is also about understanding how human beings remember, how they turn landscapes into moral lessons, and how they preserve truth in the form of story. This broader perspective does not diminish the legend. On the contrary, it enriches it. To see Iram as a symbol of the lost cities of Arabia is to place it within a tapestry of cultures that thrived and disappeared long before our time. It allows us to hear in the legend the echoes of real people, real caravans, and real walls of stone now buried by sand. It also reminds us that the desert is never truly empty. It holds memories beneath its surface, waiting for those who know how to listen. And so the legend of the City of the Pillars grows even larger when set against the backdrop of Arabia's hidden kingdoms. It is not the story of one city alone, but of many, layered and intertwined, each one leaving its mark on the imagination of those who crossed the sands. The ruins of the Thamud, the memories of the Ad, the wealth of the incense kingdoms, all flow into the river of story that became Iram. And though the sands may have covered the stones, the memory remains, a reminder that history and myth often walk side by side. The Arabian desert is a vast expanse where silence seems eternal, but beneath that silence lies a hidden archive of human endeavor. To complete the picture of Iram within its historical setting, we must look more closely at the caravan trade that carved invisible roads through the dunes and linked scattered tribes into a network of wealth and story. For it is within the ebb and flow of these routes that both the rise and disappearance of desert kingdoms can be understood, and with them the possibility that one of these kingdoms, now lost, became the Iram of legend. The trade in incense was the lifeblood of southern Arabia. Trees that grew only in the Dhofar Mountains of Oman and in parts of Yemen produced resins that, when burned, released a fragrance unlike any other. These resins, frankincense and myrrh, were highly valued in temples from Babylon to Rome, where priests used them to bridge the human and the divine. They were also used in medicine and embalming, making them commodities worth more than gold by weight. Entire kingdoms rose to control their cultivation and distribution. The Sabaeans, the Hadramites, the Qatabanians, and the Manaeans all flourished by guarding routes, levying taxes, and protecting caravans. The caravans themselves were feats of endurance. Long lines of camels moved slowly across the desert, each animal capable of carrying hundreds of kilograms of resin. Along the routes, wells and oases became vital, and it was here that towns grew. These towns were not random. They were carefully chosen nodes in a network that stretched for thousands of kilometers. Some were fortified with walls and towers, serving as both markets and defense posts. For the merchants who traveled between them, these towns must have seemed like islands of life in an ocean of sand. Archaeological surveys have traced portions of these routes. From southern Oman and Yemen, the caravans moved northward through Najran, Mecca, and Medina, and onward to Petra and Gaza. Branches connected eastward toward Mesopotamia and westward toward Egypt. The sheer length of these journeys, often lasting months, meant that the desert was never as empty as it appears. At any given time, caravans laden with incense were crossing its breadth, guarded by tribes whose livelihoods depended on the flow of goods. It is within this world that legends of great cities would naturally arise. A town that became wealthy by taxing caravans could afford to build towers and markets that dwarfed the ordinary. A generation later, when the trade route shifted, that same town could decline rapidly, leaving only ruins behind. To those who came after, the sudden silence of such places demanded explanation. In Arabia, explanation took the form of story. If a once wealthy town vanished, surely it must have been destroyed by divine wrath, buried by a storm, or cursed for its arrogance. Thus, the memory of Iram could easily have been born from one or more of these vanished caravan towns. Geological studies add another dimension. The Rub al Khali, the empty quarter, is known today as one of the driest places on Earth, but ancient riverbeds lie beneath its sands. Satellite imagery has revealed channels that once carried water, supporting vegetation and life. These channels suggest that during certain climatic periods, the desert was less hostile than it is now. Settlements that flourished along these rivers could have supported agriculture and trade, but when the climate shifted and the rivers dried, the sands advanced. Abandonment would have been inevitable, and within a few centuries, entire communities could be erased from the surface. This pattern is not unique to Arabia. Across the world, deserts hide the bones of civilizations. In Central Asia, the Silk Road cities of Merv and Khiva once thrived but declined when rivers changed course. In the Sahara, rock art reveals that lands now barren were once green with animals and people. Arabia fits into this broader pattern, and the legend of Iram may be the Arabian expression of a universal truth, that human achievements are fragile before the forces of nature. For those who lived among the dunes, the memory of these vanished places became cautionary tales. The people of Ad were remembered as giants not only because of their supposed size, but because of the magnitude of their downfall. The Thamud were remembered as builders who believed their stone dwellings would last forever, only to vanish. Iram became the culmination of these warnings, the city of the pillars that reached too high and was buried too deep. In this way, legend became moral geography. To cross the desert was to travel through a landscape of stories, each ruin a reminder of what arrogance could bring. When European explorers entered Arabia in the 19th and early 20th centuries, they were astonished by the persistence of these tales. Guides spoke of towers swallowed by sand, of pillars glimpsed at dawn, only to vanish by noon. To scholars trained in ancient history, these stories seemed like echoes of the great civilizations they knew from Mesopotamia and Egypt. To explorers fueled by romantic imagination, they became evidence that an Arabian Atlantis might truly exist. The desert, with its endless horizons, became the stage upon which myth and science clashed. The search for Iram was never only about stones or pillars. It was about the desire to connect the present with the grandeur of the past. For Arabs, the legend tied them to a heritage of ancient kingdoms that once made Arabia central to the world's trade. For Europeans, it was a chance to uncover a city that would rival Troy or Nineveh. For all, it was a reminder that deserts are not emptiness but archives, their pages written in sand rather than stone. And so, as the 20th century dawned, the legend of Iram stood at the threshold of a new era. Oral tradition and folklore had preserved it for centuries. Archaeological surveys had begun to map the trade routes that hinted at its context. Geological studies were revealing the ancient rivers that once flowed through the empty quarter. The stage was set for modern science to enter the story. The search for the City of the Pillars was about to move from legend to investigation, from campfire tales to satellite imagery, from whispered memory to maps drawn in laboratories. Yet the mystery remained unsolved, for the desert is not easily conquered. Even with new tools, the sands resist. They cover what they choose to cover and reveal only fragments. The explorers who set out to find Iram in the 20th century would face both triumph and frustration. For the legend is not merely a question of archaeology. It is a question of how much the past allows itself to be found, and how much it insists on remaining hidden. The 20th century brought new eyes to the desert, eyes that could see beyond the reach of caravans and explorers. For centuries, Iram had remained in the realm of scripture and folklore, a city of the pillars remembered in stories but never mapped on Earth. Yet as technology advanced, the tools of modern science were turned toward Arabia's vast emptiness, and the legend of the Atlantis of the sands began to shift into the language of archaeology. The most dramatic moment in this transformation came in the early 1990s, when satellites orbiting the Earth looked down upon the Rub al Khali and revealed what no human survey had ever captured: the ghostly tracks of ancient caravans converging on a single point in the desert of Oman. The story begins with a project that seemed at first to have little to do with ancient ruins. In the late 1980s, researchers at NASA were experimenting with satellite imagery to map geological features. The aim was to test whether radar and thermal imaging could penetrate the surface of the desert to reveal buried channels, riverbeds, and trade routes. The Rub al Khali, with its shifting dunes and trackless horizons, offered the perfect test ground. When the data came back, the images revealed faint but undeniable lines stretching across the sand. These lines were the remnants of caravan trails etched into the earth by centuries of camels' hooves. The trails converged at a point near a village called Shizr in the Dhofar region of Oman. To archaeologists familiar with the legend of Iram, this convergence was electrifying. It suggested that Shizr had once been a major stop for caravans carrying incense northward. If the caravans had all passed through this place, then it must have been a hub of trade, a settlement of significance. The question was whether this was the long-lost Iram of the Pillars. Excavations began at Shizr in the early 1990s, led by archaeologists from Oman, working with international teams. What they found was intriguing. Beneath the surface of the sand lay the ruins of a settlement with stone foundations, walls, and most strikingly, a collapsed tower that had once been part of a fortress. The remains suggested that Shizr was not merely a village, but a fortified caravanserai, a place where merchants could rest, store goods, and protect themselves from raiders. The discovery matched the idea of a wealthy settlement linked to the incense trade, but whether it was Iram remained uncertain. The collapsed tower became a symbol of the site. Archaeologists discovered that it had been built above a limestone cavern. Over time, the cavern roof weakened, and eventually it gave way, swallowing part of the fortress. The collapse was dramatic, leaving behind rubble that spoke of sudden disaster. For those who believed in the legend of Iram, this collapse seemed like confirmation of the Qur'anic description of a city destroyed by divine wrath. For geologists, it was a reminder that natural processes can be as devastating as any myth. The coincidence of legend and geology made the site at Shizr irresistible to the imagination. Artifacts recovered from the site added further depth. Pottery fragments, beads, and tools pointed to a community that was active during the early centuries of the first millennium. The dating aligned with the height of the incense trade, when Arabia supplied temples across the Mediterranean world. The ruins bore witness to a settlement that had thrived on trade but had eventually been abandoned. Whether it was swallowed by collapse, bypassed by shifting routes, or undone by climate, the result was the same: silence and then sand. News of the discovery spread quickly. Newspapers declared that the lost city of Iram had been found. Headlines spoke of the Atlantis of the sands revealed by space-age technology. The idea that satellites orbiting Earth had rediscovered a city buried for centuries captured the public imagination. For a time, Shizr was celebrated as proof that the legend was real, that the Qur'an's brief verses had pointed to a historical truth now confirmed by archaeology. Yet scholars urged caution. The ruins at Shizr were real, but were they Iram? The Qur'an's description of Iram as the city of the pillars could be interpreted in many ways. The pillars might have referred to towers or to tribal leaders or even to the tall tents used by desert peoples. There was no inscription at Shizr naming the city, no direct link to the ad. It was possible that the site was simply one of many caravan towns, important in its time but later abandoned. The temptation to equate it with Iram was strong, but the evidence remained circumstantial. The debate between certainty and speculation did not diminish the significance of the discovery. What Shizr revealed was that the desert held more than emptiness. It held ruins waiting to be uncovered by the tools of modern science. The fact that ancient caravan routes could be traced from space proved that the desert was not impenetrable. It was an archive that could be read with new eyes. Whether or not Shizr was Iram, it had shown that the legend was plausible, that a city of the pillars could indeed lie hidden beneath the sands. For the people of Oman, the discovery was a source of pride. It connected them to the ancient incense trade, reminding the world that Arabia had once been a center of global commerce. For scholars, it was a case study in how legend and archaeology intertwine, each shaping the interpretation of the other. For the wider public, it was a reminder that even in the age of satellites and computers, the allure of lost cities endures. The search for Iram had entered a new phase. It was no longer only a question of campfire tales or explorers' reports. It had become a question of data, excavation, and interpretation. Yet the legend remained unresolved, for even as Shizr revealed its ruins, the sands seemed to whisper that more secrets lay hidden still. And so the debate continued. Had Iram been found, or was it still waiting, buried somewhere deeper in the empty quarter? The excavations at Shisar stirred excitement across the world, yet the deeper archaeologists dug, the more complex the picture became. The site revealed layers of occupation that stretched across centuries, suggesting it was not a single great city, but rather a fortified stop that grew, declined, and was rebuilt many times. Stone walls marked the outlines of storage rooms, and traces of hearths revealed where travelers may have cooked their meals while resting on long journeys. The collapsed tower, so dramatic in its ruin, became the most visible reminder of how fragile desert settlements could be, even when built with care. Researchers noted that Shisar had all the hallmarks of a caravanserai. It lay at the junction of multiple trade routes. Its walls and tower would have served to protect goods and travelers. Within its enclosure, merchants carrying frankincense from the Dhofar Mountains could rest before beginning the long trek north toward the Levant and Mesopotamia. The site was practical, functional, and valuable. But was it the city described in legend, the Iram of the Pillars? The evidence was suggestive but far from conclusive. One of the most compelling aspects of Shisar was its association with sinkholes and caves. The Dhofar region is riddled with limestone formations which can collapse suddenly when underground chambers weaken. Such collapses can swallow entire structures, creating the appearance of a city destroyed in an instant. For storytellers, such an event would be irresistible. A fortress that vanished into the earth could easily be remembered as a city struck down by divine wrath. The Qur'an's reference to the people of Ad being swept away by a violent wind may thus reflect natural disasters retold as cosmic punishment. The overlap between geology and legend was too close to ignore. The artifacts recovered from Shisar painted a picture of a community deeply connected to long-distance trade. Pottery fragments matched styles from across Arabia and beyond, indicating exchange with distant cultures. Beads and ornaments suggested that goods passed through Shisar not only as raw resins, but as part of a network of luxury items. The settlement thrived on its position as a node in a vast system. This economic importance may explain why its memory endured long after its walls crumbled. A city that controlled wealth flowing to empires would naturally inspire tales of grandeur, and its disappearance would demand an explanation worthy of its former power. Despite this, the absence of inscriptions naming Iram or linking Shisar to the Ad remained a problem. Without such evidence, the connection rested on interpretation. Some scholars argued that Iram might never have been a single site. Instead, it could represent a collective memory of many caravan settlements, each one contributing a thread to the tapestry of legend. Shisar, in this view, was simply the most visible of these, preserved in stone while others lay buried under dunes. Others maintained that Shisar was indeed Iram, the very city mentioned in the Qur'an. Its collapse into limestone caverns transformed into story by centuries of retelling. The debate highlighted the tension between archaeology and myth. Archaeology seeks precise evidence, datable layers, measurable artifacts. Myth thrives on symbols, exaggeration, and moral lessons. When the two intersect, as they did at Shisar, interpretation becomes as important as discovery. To declare Shisar as Iram was to merge science with story. To deny the connection was to leave the legend unanchored. Neither side could claim certainty, and so the mystery of Iram endured. What the discovery at Shisar did accomplish was to change the way people viewed the empty quarter. No longer could it be seen as a void without history. The satellite images had revealed that beneath its dunes lay the tracks of countless caravans, routes that carried the wealth of Arabia across continents. Shisar was proof that the desert had once been alive with movement, commerce, and culture. The idea of a lost city hidden in its depths was no longer a fantasy, it was a possibility supported by real evidence. The global fascination with the find was fueled not only by archaeology but by the drama of its discovery. The idea that a Quranic legend had been rediscovered by space-age satellites captured imaginations worldwide. Newspapers called it the marriage of science and scripture. Documentaries presented Shisar as the Atlantis of the sands. For many, it seemed like proof that myths carry truth, that even the most mysterious legends may hold kernels of history waiting to be uncovered. Yet even amid the excitement, archaeologists themselves remained cautious. They reminded the public that evidence is fragile, that linking a site to a legend requires more than enthusiasm. Still, the power of the story was undeniable. Once Shisar had been named as a candidate for Iram, it could never escape that association. The ruins became a symbol of how the desert conceals and reveals, how legend and fact can intertwine until they are indistinguishable. For Oman, the discovery brought cultural and national significance. The site of Shisar was promoted as a heritage landmark, a reminder that the land of the frankincense trade had once stood at the center of ancient commerce. Visitors came to see the ruins, to stand where caravans had once gathered, and to imagine the towers that had crumbled into the earth. For the Bedouins whose ancestors had told stories of vanished cities, the site offered a tangible link to their oral traditions. The legend of Iram, once intangible, now had stones that could be touched. In the end, the discovery at Shisar may not have answered the question of Iram definitively, but it transformed the search. It demonstrated that the desert, long thought to be empty, was in fact a repository of hidden histories. It showed that modern technology could uncover what centuries of exploration could not. And it reminded the world that myths endure not only because of what they say, but because of the mysteries they keep alive. The debate over whether Shisar is truly Iram continues, but in a sense the answer may not matter. What matters is that the legend was brought into dialogue with science, that faith and archaeology found a point of meeting in the sands of Oman. Whether or not the city of the pillars has been found, the search itself has revealed a truth. The desert remembers, even when it seems silent, and its memory waits for those who know how to look. The discovery of Shisar quickly entered the realm of legend itself, for it was not only an archaeological site but also a story that united science, faith, and imagination. In the early 1990s, television crews arrived in Oman to film documentaries about the Atlantis of the sands. The ruins of the collapsed fortress were shown to audiences across the world, framed as the fulfillment of a mystery that had lingered for over 1,000 years. In the excitement, Shisar was often presented as if it were unquestionably Iram, the city of the pillars spoken of in the Qur'an. Yet as the dust of publicity settled, archaeologists emphasized the need for caution. The ruins of Shisar were real, but their scale did not match the grandeur described in folklore. The site was modest, more a fortified caravanserai than a metropolis of towers. It may have been important as a hub on the incense trade, but to claim it as Iram was to risk stretching evidence beyond what it could bear. For believers in the legend, this caution seemed like unnecessary hesitation. For scholars, it was the difference between fact and speculation. The tension reflected a larger challenge in the interpretation of ancient texts. When scripture describes a city with pillars whose like had not been created in the lands, should we read it literally, expecting to find vast stone towers buried beneath the sands? Or should we read it symbolically, understanding the pillars as a metaphor for strength, leadership, or tribal power? These questions cannot be answered with ruins alone. They require careful study of language, context, and history. At Shisar, the absence of inscriptions naming the city left the debate unresolved. Despite these uncertainties, the discovery of Ubar, as Shisar came to be called, had profound effects. It shifted the search for Iram from speculation to serious archaeology. It demonstrated that modern technology could reveal ancient trade routes hidden beneath dunes. It gave tangible form to a legend long thought beyond the reach of science. And it inspired further exploration, as archaeologists and geologists realized that the empty quarter might conceal many more secrets. The site also raised new questions. If Shisar was a hub on the incense trade, how many other such hubs might lie undiscovered? Could Iram, if it existed as a larger settlement, still be hidden elsewhere beneath the sands? Was Ubar a single city, or was the name used to describe a region or a network of settlements? Each possibility carried its own implications, and none could yet be proven. For the people of Oman, the significance of Ubar extended beyond archaeology. It became part of cultural heritage, a symbol of the region's role in the ancient world. The frankincense trade, once the source of immense wealth, had placed Arabia at the center of global exchange. To recover a piece of that history was to reclaim a place in the narrative of world civilizations. Shissa, whether or not it was Iram, became a monument to the endurance of memory in the desert. The story of Ubar illustrates how discovery can never fully silence mystery. Instead, it often amplifies it. The ruins were real, but their meaning remained contested. The legend of Iram continued, now enriched by a new chapter in which satellites, archaeologists, and geologists joined the storytellers and poets. Each group sought to interpret the ruins, to assign them a place in history or myth. Each interpretation carried weight, but none could claim finality. And so the search pressed onward. Ubar at Shissa was perhaps a piece of the puzzle, but it did not close the book. The desert, vast and unyielding, still held many places where ruins might lie. The sands shift, concealing and revealing, and beneath them might rest other settlements that once flourished and vanished. The discovery of Ubar was both an answer and an invitation, reminding us that the desert has always been both archive and mystery. As scholars debated and explorers dreamed, the legend of Iram retained its power. Whether or not Ubar was the city of the pillars, the allure of the Atlantis of the sands endured. It stood as a bridge between faith and science, a story that could not be contained by ruins alone. For even when archaeology uncovers stones, legend continues to whisper of towers that touch the sky and a people undone by pride. And in that whisper lies the reason why the search for Iram has never ended. The Quran's description of Iram as the city of the pillars has fascinated generations of scholars and believers alike. The phrase is brief, yet evocative. What were these pillars? Were they the towering stone columns of a grand city, gleaming under the desert sun? Were they monumental tents supported by tall wooden posts, symbols of nomadic power? Or were they a metaphor for the tribal leaders who stood like pillars of strength among their people? Each interpretation has its advocates, and each reveals a different aspect of how history and legend intertwine in Arabia. Archaeologists who examined the ruins at Shissa noted that its most striking feature was the remains of a collapsed tower, one that once stood above the limestone cavern that later gave way. This tower and the walls surrounding it suggest that stone pillars were indeed a part of the settlement's architecture. Yet the scale is modest compared with the grandeur described in folklore. No massive forest of columns has been unearthed, no avenue of marble colonnades like those at Palmyra or Baalbek. If Iram was a city of stone pillars, its remains may lie elsewhere, still hidden beneath the sands, or they may have crumbled so thoroughly that only fragments remain. Another interpretation comes from the traditions of nomadic Arabia. For the Bedouin, the tent is both home and symbol. Some tents of wealthy tribes were enormous, supported by tall wooden poles that could easily be called pillars. These tents served not only as dwellings but also as centers of power where leaders received guests and made decisions. To describe Iram as the city of the pillars may have been to evoke this image, suggesting a community of tribes whose strength rested on their leaders, each one a pillar of authority. This reading transforms the verse from an architectural description into a political one, reminding listeners that power is not only in stone but also in people. The wealth that made such symbols possible came from trade, especially the trade in incense. Frankincense and myrrh, harvested from the hardy trees of southern Arabia, were in constant demand across the ancient world. Temples in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Rome burned incense daily as offerings to the gods. Physicians used it in medicine, and embalmers in Egypt employed it in the mummification of pharaohs. The trade in these resins turned remote corners of Arabia into the source of a commodity worth its weight in gold. Caravans laden with sacks of incense crossed the desert, their camels trudging along routes that were both lifelines and symbols of wealth. Archaeological excavations across Oman and Yemen have revealed settlements that thrived on this trade. At sites such as Khor Rori in Oman, the ruins of ports show where ships once carried incense to India and beyond. At inland sites like Shissa, pottery and beads attest to exchange with distant lands. Inscriptions carved into stone record the names of rulers who taxed the trade and built monuments from its profits. Together, these finds paint a picture of Arabia not as an isolated wilderness, but as a hub of global commerce, tied to empires that stretched across 3 continents. The prosperity brought by incense also brought vulnerability. Wealth attracts envy, and control of trade routes required constant defense. Towers and walls rose to guard wells and storage sites. Some of these towers may be the very pillars remembered in legend. To a traveler crossing the desert, the sight of tall stone towers rising from an oasis would have been striking, a signal that wealth and protection lay ahead. These towers, built to defend commerce, may have become the architectural memory that later generations elevated into the image of Iram, the city of the pillars. Artifacts found at Shissa and other sites add texture to this story. Pottery fragments suggest long-distance connections, with styles echoing those of Mesopotamia and the Levant. Beads made from shell and stone indicate exchange with coastal and inland cultures alike. Even simple tools preserved beneath sand tell of daily life in communities that balance the harshness of the desert with the opportunities of trade. Each object is small, yet together they speak of a world where commerce, culture, and survival intertwined. And still, the myth of giants persisted. For Bedouin storytellers, ruins such as those at Madain Saleh or Shissa were too massive to have been built by ordinary men. They imagined that giants, beings of immense stature, had once walked the desert, shaping stones with their hands. These giants, identified with the people of Ad, were remembered as both powerful and doomed. Their pillars, whether of stone or tent, were symbols of their strength but also of their arrogance. To believe that one's works could last forever was the ultimate folly, for time and desert winds would reduce even the tallest tower to rubble. Thus, the pillars of Iram became more than architectural features. They became symbols of ambition, power, and pride. Whether carved from stone, raised from wood, or embodied in human leaders, the pillars represented the strength of a people who believed themselves beyond compare. Their destruction, whether by storm, collapse, or abandonment, turned the pillars into warnings. To speak of Iram was to recall not only wealth and grandeur, but also the inevitable downfall that follows arrogance. The archaeological finds provide glimpses of the people behind the legend, but they cannot silence the myths. In every shard of pottery and every fallen stone, imagination still hears echoes of towers that touch the sky. For some, the pillars of Iram are a literal city waiting to be uncovered. For others, they are metaphors, reminders of human pride. Both interpretations survive, woven together in a story that continues to captivate. And so the legend moves forward. The people of the pillars may have left behind ruins of trade and towers of stone, but the giants of story still walk beside them. In this way, archaeology and myth remain inseparable, each shaping the way we see the desert's hidden past. The ruins scattered across Arabia tell a story not only of trade, but of ambition and collapse. At Shissa, the tower that crumbled into a limestone cavern became the most visible emblem of this story. Geological surveys revealed that the entire settlement was built above unstable ground, honeycombed with caves formed over millennia. To live and build in such a place was to court disaster, yet the location was irresistible. It lay at the junction of trade routes, sustained by nearby wells, and offered a defensible position in a dangerous land. The people who built their fortress there may have believed the foundations unshakable. When the ground gave way, their confidence was shattered, and their settlement began its decline. To later generations, the memory of this collapse would have seemed like divine judgment. A city swallowed by the earth or destroyed by storm was not merely a geological event, it was a message. Oral tradition preserved the drama, stripping away geological detail and amplifying the moral lesson. The Qur'an spoke of a people of the pillars destroyed for their arrogance, and the ruins at Shissa seemed to echo that verse. In this way, archaeology and scripture intertwined, each shaping the way the other was understood. Inscriptions across Arabia reinforced the sense of a world both prosperous and fragile. South Arabian texts describe rulers dedicating wealth to gods, recording victories and boasting of building projects. Yet many of these kingdoms declined suddenly, their inscriptions ending as abruptly as they began. Climate change, overuse of land, and shifts in trade all played their part. The pillars of their cities, whether in stone or memory, could not resist time. Their voices remain only as faint carvings on rock, whispers in a script long silent. Still, the stories of giants persisted, perhaps because they captured the sense of awe inspired by these ruins. To the desert tribes, the scale of the monuments demanded explanation. Ordinary men could not have built such structures, so giants must have walked the sands. These giants, remembered as the people of Ad, embodied both strength and downfall. They were beings whose arrogance matched their size, destroyed in a storm that swept their towers away. Scholars recognize in this the symbolic exaggeration of human memory, yet the symbolism itself carries truth. The ruins did once belong to powerful peoples, and their collapse was indeed dramatic. Myth did not invent the fall, it magnified it. To walk among the remains of these ancient towns today is to feel both history and legend pressing against one another. Stones lie scattered in silence, their shapes eroded by centuries of wind, yet each one carries the weight of stories told under desert skies. A pillar toppled by time becomes the remnant of a giant's house. A collapsed wall becomes the judgment of heaven. The line between archaeology and myth blurs, and in that blur the fascination of Iram endures. Thus, the pillars of Iram stand at the heart of its mystery. Whether they were towers of stone, poles of tents, or leaders of tribes, they symbolize a people who believed themselves unmatched. Their wealth came from incense, their strength from trade, and their arrogance from believing that their greatness would last forever. The sands proved otherwise. The desert swallowed their works, leaving only fragments to be uncovered by archaeologists and magnified by storytellers. The legend of the pillars reminds us that the desert is not empty. It is filled with memory, with ruins and whispers of civilizations once powerful. To seek Iram is to seek not only a city but the truth hidden in the space between history and story. The pillars rise in imagination even when they lie broken in stone, and their shadow stretches across the centuries as a reminder that no greatness is immune to time. And so the myth persists. Archaeology uncovers shards and walls, geology explains collapses, inscriptions speak faintly of kings and trade, yet the story of Iram continues to tell of giants, arrogance, and downfall. The desert, in its silence, keeps both truths. The city of the pillars may have been a fortress above a cavern, or a network of caravan towns, or a memory preserved in scripture. But in legend it is more, always more, a city whose like was not created in the lands, remembered forever as both history and warning. From the earliest recitations of the legend, the people of Iram were described as immense in stature, so large that their footsteps shook the desert floor and their hands shaped pillars that reached toward the sky. These were the giants of the tribe of Ad, remembered as both powerful and doomed. To the Bedouins who preserved the story, the ruins of ancient walls and tombs scattered across Arabia could only have been the work of such beings. Ordinary men, they reasoned, could not carve facades into mountains or build towers in the middle of the desert. Giants alone could have left such marks. The Qur'an presents the people of Ad as a community given great strength but corrupted by arrogance. They are described as builders of monuments, dwellers in Iram of the pillars, who ignored the prophet Hud and met destruction in a storm that lasted 7 nights and 8 days. The description is poetic, yet it resonates with a universal theme found across cultures. When greatness breeds arrogance, collapse follows. In Arabia, this warning took the form of the giants of the desert, who rose higher than any other but were swept away by forces they could not withstand. Parallels can be found in other ancient traditions. The Hebrew scriptures speak of the Nephilim, mysterious figures described as mighty men of old, some interpreting them as giants who lived before the flood. Greek mythology recalls the Titans, primeval beings of enormous power who were cast down by the Olympian gods. In Mesopotamian lore, the Epic of Gilgamesh describes heroes of extraordinary stature who sought eternal fame. These stories, though separated by geography, share a common pattern, a memory of beings larger than life, whose power was both a gift and a curse. Why do so many cultures remember giants? One explanation lies in the psychology of ruins. When ancient people encountered structures larger and more enduring than anything they themselves could build, They assumed that only beings of great size and strength could have created them. The colossal statues of Egypt, the standing stones of Britain, the cliff dwellings of Arabia, all inspired the belief that giants once roamed the earth. The ruins were real, but the scale was explained through imagination. Giants became a bridge between human memory and the overwhelming presence of monuments. In Arabia, the story of the Ad served a dual function. It explained the ruins scattered across the desert, and it warned against arrogance. The people of the pillars were not remembered only for their size, but for their pride. They believed themselves invincible, their towers unshakable, their wealth unending. When the storm came, it destroyed not only their bodies but also their illusion of permanence. To tell the story of the giants was to remind each generation that no matter how great their works, they too could be swept away. Archaeology does not confirm the existence of literal giants, but it does confirm the presence of peoples who built on a scale impressive enough to inspire such tales. The Thamud, with their rock-cut dwellings at Madain Saleh, created facades taller than any ordinary house. To a traveler stumbling upon them centuries later, abandoned and silent, the site would have seemed otherworldly. The Sabaeans and Hadramites of southern Arabia constructed fortresses with massive walls, their remains still visible in Yemen. Each ruin, stripped of context, became evidence of giants in the imagination of those who saw them. The persistence of these stories also reveals how myth preserves symbolic truth. Giants represent excess, power beyond measure, ambition without humility. To call the people of Iram giants was to say that their arrogance matched their strength, and that both led to their downfall. In this sense, the giants of the desert are not literal beings but moral figures, embodiments of the dangers of pride. Their destruction serves as a cautionary tale, ensuring that their memory endures not as admiration but as warning. Bedouin storytellers carried these tales across centuries. Around their campfires beneath the vast sweep of the night sky, they spoke of the tribe of Ad, whose men could lift stones with their bare hands and whose women were taller than palm trees. They described how these giants built a city of shining towers, only to see it erased by a storm that buried them beneath the sand. The stories blended awe with fear, for to imagine such beings was to recognize both the greatness of the past and the fragility of the present. Even in modern times, stories of giants linger in desert folklore. Travelers tell of bones discovered in dunes, enormous and ancient, which they claim belong to the people of Ad. In reality, these bones often prove to be those of large animals such as camels or even fossilized remains of extinct species. Yet the imagination seizes upon them, transforming them into proof of giants. The desert, with its silence and mystery, invites such interpretations. Each stone, each ruin, each bone can be woven into the fabric of legend. And so, the giants of the desert endure, not as physical beings but as symbols. They stand as a reminder that the greatness of civilizations is always vulnerable, that pride invites destruction, and that memory magnifies ruins into myth. Whether carved into scripture, preserved in folklore, or glimpsed in the imagination of a traveler, the giants of Iram continue to walk in story, their shadows stretching across the sands. The giants of the desert did not belong only to Arabia. Their echoes are found across the ancient world, but in Arabia they served as the clearest bridge between myth and visible ruins. When Bedouins walked among facades at Madain Saleh or across broken towers in Oman, they told themselves that such feats could not have been achieved by ordinary men. The tribe of Ad became a vessel for that awe, remembered as men of immense stature, larger than any living descendant, a people who lived beyond human scale. Even though archaeology shows that these ruins were built by skilled but very human hands, the symbolic power of the giants has outlived the evidence. The story of beings who could carry pillars and raise towers without effort offered a way for later generations to preserve the memory of greatness. The giants stood for ambition and excess. Their destruction stood for the punishment of arrogance. It is not coincidence that the Qur'an places the story of the Ad alongside other tales of communities undone by pride. The giants became not only builders of the desert but moral figures, remembered because they embodied both strength and downfall. This pattern of storytelling is found elsewhere. The Bible's Nephilim, the Titans of Greece, and the heroes of Mesopotamian epics all serve similar roles. They represent the exaggeration of memory, the enlargement of past figures into beings who stand taller than ordinary history. To tell of giants is to admit that what came before feels larger than what exists now, and to clothe that memory in forms that match the awe it inspires. In this way, the story of giants reveals not literal beings, but the human instinct to magnify the past. Even so, the desert itself seems to invite belief. Fossilized remains of extinct animals, fragments of large bones, and even weathered stones can take on shapes that suggest enormous beings. Each discovery becomes fuel for the imagination. Travelers speak of bones the length of men, half buried in sand, taken as proof that the tribe of Ad once walked here. Science explains them as the remains of ancient beasts, but story gives them human form. The desert's silence leaves room for both explanations, and so the myth persists. What is remarkable is not whether giants truly existed, but how their legend preserved real memories. The tribe of Ad may symbolize early Arabian peoples who built prosperous settlements in fertile valleys. Their sudden disappearance, perhaps due to storms or droughts, became remembered as the annihilation of giants. The exaggeration protected the essence of the memory, ensuring it survived when details faded. Myth kept alive the truth that Arabia once held powerful cultures whose ruins still astonish. The story of the giants has endured for more than 1,000 years because it satisfies both wonder and warning. It explains the ruins that still stand and delivers a lesson that arrogance brings destruction. The giants of the desert continue to walk, not in flesh but in story, towering over the imagination of those who cross the dunes. And in their shadow the search for Iram takes on greater depth, for if a city of giants once fell, perhaps its ruins still lie hidden, waiting for the sands to shift and reveal them again. The desert does not destroy quickly. It erodes slowly, swallowing walls grain by grain, disguising foundations under shifting dunes. Yet the fall of a city can seem sudden, and when it happens, the silence that follows is so complete that memory transforms the loss into catastrophe. The story of Iram's collapse has long been told as divine wrath, a storm that howled for 7 nights and 8 days until every tower crumbled and every giant was gone. Archaeology and geology, however, suggest a quieter but no less dramatic explanation. At Shissa in Oman, where the ruins of a fortress lie above a collapsed limestone cavern, scientists found evidence of sudden geological change. The Dhofar region is riddled with underground chambers carved by water over thousands of years. When the ceiling of one of these caverns weakens, it can collapse without warning, dragging surface structures down with it. Such sinkholes are still seen in the region today, opening overnight and leaving gaping pits where solid ground once stood. To those who lived at Shissa, the sudden collapse of their tower into the earth would have felt like the judgment of heaven. To later storytellers, the disaster became the destruction of an entire city, transformed into legend through centuries of retelling. Yet, geology tells only part of the story. The prosperity of Iram, whether it was Shissa or another settlement, depended on trade routes that were never permanent. The incense trade flourished when demand was high in temples of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Rome. But when new trade paths opened by sea or when empires shifted their priorities, the long overland caravans became less profitable. A city built on taxing and supplying those caravans could decline swiftly once the camels stopped coming. Archaeologists note that many caravan towns were abandoned not because they were destroyed, but because their lifeline of trade withered. Climate, too, played its part. Geological and climatological studies show that Arabia has experienced cycles of wetter and drier periods. In times of rainfall, valleys bloomed and supported settlements. In times of drought, the land hardened and oases shrank. A city that depended on wells and seasonal rains could not survive when the skies turned against it. The Qur'an's image of a storm may encode this memory, describing in poetic form a climate shift that left once fertile valleys barren. To those who saw their land wither, it must have felt like a punishment beyond human control. The collapse of a city is rarely a single event. It is more often the convergence of multiple forces: geology, trade, and climate pressing against human ambition. The story of Iram's downfall, told as divine wrath, may preserve the memory of this convergence. A tower swallowed by a cavern, caravans turning away to new routes, and skies closing against the desert together left a silence that could only be explained by catastrophe. In story, that silence became the storm that raged for 7 nights and 8 days. For archaeologists, the ruins at Shisur show a settlement that declined gradually after disaster. For storytellers, it was erased in an instant. The truth may lie between the two. Catastrophe began the collapse, but time completed it. The desert covered what remained, and memory clothed the silence in legend. The fall of Iram became not only history but symbol, a lesson about arrogance, fragility, and the forces that undo even the proudest towers. The collapse of Iram was not a single moment frozen in time, but a process where nature, trade, and climate converged to undo a people who once believed themselves unshakable. After the initial disasters, whether a sinkhole swallowing part of a fortress or a storm destroying crops, the city faced pressures that could not be resisted. The caravans that once brought wealth may have changed course, drawn to other routes that offered safety or speed. The incense trade itself declined as maritime shipping replaced overland travel, carrying goods faster and more cheaply across the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. What had once been a hub of prosperity suddenly stood at the margins of commerce. Without caravans, a caravanserai becomes a ruin. Without trade, towers lose their purpose. The pillars of Iram, whether stone or symbolic, could not stand without the lifeblood of exchange. Archaeologists have found evidence across Arabia of towns abandoned as trade routes shifted. Some were gradually swallowed by sand, others eroded until only fragments remained. To those who came later, these silences seemed inexplicable. Why would a city of wealth be deserted? Divine judgment became the most compelling answer, turning the slow unraveling of trade and climate into a single act of punishment. The desert itself helped seal this memory. When a river valley dries, the land becomes uninhabitable. When dunes advance, they bury walls and erase roads. Within a few generations, all that remains is story. Oral tradition took the fragments and wove them into a coherent tale of arrogance and downfall. A storm that lasted 7 nights and 8 days became the shorthand for a collapse that may have unfolded across decades. The legend gave meaning to loss, ensuring it was remembered not as chance but as lesson. This transformation of natural disaster into divine judgment is a pattern seen throughout history. The eruption of Thera may lie behind the Greek tale of Atlantis. Floods along the Tigris and Euphrates shaped Mesopotamian myths of deluge. Earthquakes in the Levant may have inspired biblical imagery of destruction. In Arabia, sinkholes, storms, and desertification became the wrath that destroyed Iram. Nature provided the events, and memory provided the story. For modern science, the collapse of Iram is a reminder of how fragile civilizations are in harsh environments. Cities depend on trade, water, and climate, and when any of these fail, collapse follows swiftly. Yet for legend, the fall of Iram is more than fragility. It is a warning about arrogance, a story meant to remind each generation that no power is eternal. The archaeological evidence of collapse and the scriptural account of divine wrath converge in this point. Greatness, whether of giants or traders, cannot stand forever against the forces of earth and time. And so Iram's collapse endures in both stone and story. The desert preserves its silence, archaeologists uncover its ruins, and storytellers keep alive the memory of its giants and its storm. Whether explained by geology or by judgment, the fall of the City of the Pillars remains a symbol of impermanence, a reminder that even in the vastness of the desert, nothing lasts forever. When the ruins of Arabia first reached the imagination of the West, they were wrapped not only in sand but in story. Travelers and scholars arriving in the 19th and early 20th centuries encountered Bedouin tales of a lost city buried by divine wrath and they carried these stories back to Europe. There, they found a ready comparison. To a mind steeped in the classics, a vanished city of wealth and pride could only be likened to Plato's Atlantis. Thus, Iram, the city of the pillars, became known as the Atlantis of the sands. Few figures capture this fascination more vividly than Thomas Edward Lawrence, remembered as Lawrence of Arabia. During his travels across the Arabian Peninsula in the early 20th century, Lawrence heard stories of a city swallowed by the desert. He wrote of the legend in letters and essays, calling it the Atlantis of the sands. To him, the comparison was irresistible. Just as Plato's Atlantis was a warning against hubris, so too was Iram a parable of pride destroyed. Lawrence never claimed to have found the city, but his words ensured that the legend would become part of Western lore, woven into the romantic image of Arabia that filled books and films. The phrase Atlantis of the sands spread quickly. Explorers who followed Lawrence adopted it, journalists used it in headlines, and popular culture embraced it as a name that blended mystery with grandeur. For a Western audience familiar with the myth of Atlantis, the comparison gave Iram instant resonance. It was no longer only a Quranic city remembered in Bedouin stories. It was part of a global tradition of lost civilizations, a desert counterpart to the island that sank beneath the sea. The parallel, however, reveals both similarities and differences. Plato's Atlantis was never presented as literal history. It was a philosophical tale told to illustrate the dangers of unchecked ambition. Scholars still debate whether Plato drew upon real events such as the eruption of Thera, but most agree that Atlantis was designed as allegory. Iram, by contrast, is anchored in scripture. Its destruction is presented not as a fable but as a remembered judgment. To equate the two is to blur a distinction between parable and faith, but it is precisely this blur that makes the comparison so compelling. For explorers, the legend of a city swallowed by sand carried the same allure as a city drowned by the sea. Both spoke of grandeur undone, of human pride erased by forces greater than themselves. Both offered the tantalizing possibility of discovery. If Atlantis could one day be found beneath the ocean, perhaps Iram could be uncovered beneath the dunes. The desert, like the sea, became a veil behind which the past might still survive, waiting for those bold enough to seek it. The rise of modern archaeology added fuel to this dream. Each time a lost city was rediscovered, Troy in Turkey, Nineveh in Mesopotamia, Petra in Jordan, the idea that Iram too might be real gained credibility. Newspapers in Europe reported rumors of ruins seen by explorers, half-buried towers glimpsed in the empty quarter, or Bedouin tales of pillars revealed by shifting dunes. Most of these accounts were exaggerated or unverifiable, but they kept alive the sense that Iram was not merely legend. Like Atlantis, it hovered between impossibility and inevitability, a city half imagined and half expected. The image of Iram as the Atlantis of the sands also spoke to deeper anxieties of the modern age. In a century marked by rapid industrialization, wars, and shifting empires, the idea that even the greatest civilizations could vanish overnight carried particular weight. Iram, like Atlantis, was a mirror in which the fragility of human achievement could be seen. The sands of Arabia became not only a landscape but a metaphor, a reminder that wealth and power are always vulnerable to forces beyond control. And so the legend of Iram entered global consciousness. No longer confined to Quranic verses or Bedouin campfires, it became part of a shared imagination of lost worlds. To call it the Atlantis of the sands was to place it in a lineage of stories that warn, fascinate, and inspire. Whether history or myth, fact or allegory, Iram took its place beside Plato's sunken island, a city remembered as much for its downfall as for its glory. The comparison between Iram and Atlantis grew stronger as the 20th century unfolded. Explorers in Arabia described ruins they could not date, and their accounts were often framed in European and American newspapers as discoveries of the desert Atlantis. Photographs of crumbling towers or weathered stones were published with captions that hinted at hidden cities. Even when archaeologists urged restraint, the romantic image of a buried metropolis persisted, for it resonated with something older than science, the human longing for a vanished golden age. Travel writers, many inspired by Lawrence of Arabia, carried the legend further. They wrote of the empty quarter as a sea of sand concealing secrets, a place where the wind could shift in a single night and reveal the tops of towers lost for centuries. These stories were often embroidered, but they served to root the idea of Iram in the Western imagination. The desert was no longer empty, it was an ocean with its own Atlantis, a place where history and myth blended into an irresistible vision. Scholars attempted to separate fact from story. Some argued that Iram was not a single city but a memory of many, combined in oral tradition until they became one name. Others pointed out that Atlantis itself might have roots in real disasters, such as the eruption of Thera, but was shaped into a moral tale by Plato. In this view, both Iram and Atlantis stand as examples of how memory transforms catastrophe into myth. Each is anchored in geography but magnified by imagination until it becomes larger than life. The idea of Iram as the Atlantis of the sands gained further strength with the discovery of Shisar in Oman in the 1990s. When satellite images revealed the traces of caravan routes converging on the site, journalists proclaimed that the lost city had been found. Once again, the Atlantis comparison appeared in headlines around the world. The discovery did not prove the legend, but it confirmed the possibility that ruins still lay hidden beneath the dunes. For many, that possibility was enough. The symbolism of the comparison lies not only in lost grandeur, but in the moral lessons attached to it. Atlantis was destroyed because of its arrogance, its people believing themselves greater than the gods. Iram was destroyed for its pride, its people ignoring the warnings of prophets. Both serve as cautionary tales, reminders that power without humility leads to downfall. To call Iram the Atlantis of the sands is to emphasize this moral echo, to say that the desert holds the same lessons as the sea. Yet the desert offers something the sea cannot. Sand moves constantly, covering and uncovering. A ruin may vanish for centuries, then reappear as dunes shift. This instability feeds the imagination. If Atlantis lies forever beneath the waves, unreachable, Iram may still emerge when the desert chooses. Each storm that reshapes the dunes is a reminder that the past is not fully buried. Somewhere beneath the shifting sands, towers may still stand, waiting for their moment to return. The legend of Iram as the Atlantis of the sands thus lives in a space between discovery and dream. Archaeologists uncover shards and walls, historians trace trade routes, geologists explain collapses, yet the story remains larger than evidence. It endures because it speaks not only to the past but to the present, reminding us that all civilizations, no matter how powerful, stand on fragile ground. The city of the pillars, like Atlantis, is both a memory and a warning, a mirror held up to human ambition. And so the desert continues to guard its secret. Explorers return with new tools, satellites scan the dunes, drones trace ancient paths, but Iram remains elusive. Perhaps Shisar is its remnant, perhaps it lies elsewhere still buried, or perhaps it exists only in memory. Yet the name endures, carried by scripture, folklore, and imagination. To call it the Atlantis of the sands is to admit that we see in it both history and myth, both warning and wonder. In that duality lies its power, a legend that no amount of sand can fully bury. The legend of Iram has survived for over 1,000 years because it is not held by one voice alone. It is scripture, it is archaeology, and it is myth. Each of these speaks differently, yet together they create the most enduring image of a lost city the desert has ever known. To the believer, Iram is a Quranic warning, a city of arrogance undone by divine judgment. To the archaeologist, it is a mystery of ruins, caravan trails, and collapsed towers. To the storyteller, it is a city of giants, a desert Atlantis swallowed by sand and silence. It is all of these at once, and it is the tension between them that has made the legend impossible to forget. The Qur'an describes Iram as the city of the pillars, inhabited by the tribe of Ad, who were given strength and prosperity but fell to pride. They ignored the prophet Hud, and for their disobedience they were destroyed by a furious wind that lasted 7 nights and 8 days. The passage is short, yet it lingers like a fragment of thunder in memory. The story is not offered as speculation, but as revelation. To the faithful, Iram is not merely an archaeological puzzle or a piece of folklore. It is a sign, a truth meant to endure as long as the verses themselves. Its lesson is clear. No wealth, no tower, no civilization can survive when arrogance takes the place of humility. For centuries, this was enough. The people of Arabia repeated the story in poetry and song, connecting the ruins they saw across the desert to the fate of the Ad. The message mattered more than the details. A collapsed tower was proof enough. A shifting dune that uncovered a wall was confirmation. The Qur'an gave the story permanence, grounding it in faith, while oral tradition gave it life, weaving it into the fabric of everyday storytelling. The city became a moral geography, not bound to maps but to memory. The arrival of archaeology in the 19th and 20th centuries changed the way the legend was approached. Scholars began to ask whether the city could be located, whether ruins could be uncovered that corresponded to the verses. Expeditions into Arabia were not only acts of discovery but of verification, as if the stones might bear witness to what the Qur'an had already declared. In this way, science entered the dialogue, not replacing faith or story, but adding its own language of pottery shards, collapsed limestone caverns, and satellite images. At Shisar in Oman, archaeologists uncovered what some proclaimed to be the ruins of Iram. A collapsed tower, fragments of pottery, and traces of caravan trails converging on the site all suggested that this was once an important settlement tied to the incense trade. The geology explained the collapse. Limestone caverns had weakened over millennia until one day the ground gave way. For scientists, this was a settlement whose fall could be understood through natural processes. For believers, it was confirmation of a Quranic warning retold in stone. For storytellers, it was proof that beneath the desert lay cities waiting to be uncovered. This interplay reveals something profound about Iram. Its story cannot be confined to one interpretation. To see it only as scripture is to miss the evidence of human life uncovered by archaeology. To see it only as archaeology is to ignore the moral weight carried by its destruction in the Qur'an. To see it only as myth is to miss the tangible stones that once formed walls and towers. It is all of these at once, a city preserved in 3 dimensions of memory. The balance between these voices is delicate. Faith risks tying itself too closely to ruins, as if divine truth required archaeological proof. Archaeology risks bending evidence to fit legend, seeing every tower as Iram, every collapse as divine wrath. Myth risks swallowing both, exaggerating ruins into golden cities and turning ordinary builders into giants. Yet when balanced, the 3 enrich one another. Faith gives archaeology meaning, archaeology gives faith context, and myth ensures both endure in imagination. It is for this reason that Iram continues to live so vividly. Other ancient cities are remembered in ruins, their stones placed in museums, their histories written in academic volumes. Iram lives not only in ruins but in revelation and in story. Its destruction is told not only as a natural event, but as a cosmic lesson. Its towers stand not only in stone, but in imagination. And because of this, even when archaeologists hesitate, and even when believers remind that no ruin is required, the story endures. It endures because it exists at the meeting point of what we can prove, what we believe, and what we imagine. The ruins of Arabia show how archaeology both confirms and complicates the story of Iram. At Shisar, the collapsed tower and the evidence of incense trade routes tell us of a community that once flourished at the edge of the desert. Pottery shards link it to distant lands, beads hint at exchanges with cultures far away, and the convergence of caravan tracks proves its place in the web of trade that bound Arabia to empires from Rome to India. Yet these ruins are modest compared to the grandeur described in legend. No golden pillars rise from the sand, no monumental avenues stand preserved beneath the dunes. Archaeology grounds the story, but it also reveals its limits, reminding us that myth magnifies beyond the scale of stone. This magnification is not deception, it is how memory works. When ruins are encountered after centuries of silence, they inspire awe. That awe demands explanation, and the explanation grows in the retelling. A fortress becomes a city, a settlement of traders becomes a metropolis of giants, a collapsed tower becomes the destruction of an entire people. In this way, myth preserves the essence even while it expands the scale. The truth that a community once rose in strength and fell in silence survives, even if the details are embroidered. The persistence of myth is why Iram is often called the Atlantis of the sands. Like Plato's island, it embodies the fear that greatness can vanish, that pride invites destruction, that civilizations are not eternal. But unlike Atlantis, Iram is anchored in a specific tradition of faith, rooted in Quranic verses that give it moral weight. This dual identity makes it uniquely powerful. It is at once a myth of global fascination and a revelation of sacred importance. Few other lost cities hold this balance, which is why Iram continues to inspire exploration and devotion alike. The dialogue between faith and archaeology is not new. When Schliemann uncovered ruins in Turkey, he declared them to be Troy, aligning Homer's epic with stones in the ground. When Nineveh and Babylon were excavated, the inscriptions confirmed names long known from scripture. These discoveries did not make the texts true, nor were the texts dependent on the stones. Instead, they enriched one another, weaving evidence and faith into a single fabric of memory. Iram belongs to this lineage. Its story stands on its own in the Qur'an, yet each archaeological discovery adds another layer, another voice that keeps the legend alive. Yet archaeology also teaches caution. Many times ruins have been claimed as Iram only to be reconsidered later. The temptation to announce discovery is strong because the myth is so powerful, but science requires patience. Evidence must be weighed, inscriptions must be studied, and stones must be read carefully. The danger is not that archaeology will disprove Iram, but that it will reduce the richness of the story by trying to confine it too narrowly. Iram is not only a site to be excavated, it is a story that carries meaning whether or not stones are found. Faith, too, must walk a careful path. To insist that ruins prove revelation is to misunderstand the nature of Scripture, which carries its truth in meaning, not in material remains. For many believers, the lesson of Iram is eternal regardless of archaeology. The storm that swept the people of Ad is a reminder of divine justice, whether or not we can point to walls in the desert. Yet for others, the discovery of ruins provides a tangible connection to verses, a way to see in stone what they recite in faith. Both approaches coexist, and both are valid in their own way. In this balance, myth plays the crucial role of ensuring the story never fades. Without myth, ruins become silent fragments. Without faith, they become disconnected artifacts. Without archaeology, they remain only in imagination. Together, the three sustain Iram as a city that is both lost and never lost, destroyed and never forgotten. The story is larger than evidence, larger than belief alone. It is the weaving of all three that makes Iram endure as one of the most captivating legends of human history. To search for Iram is therefore to search not only for a place, but for an understanding of how humans remember. Why do we magnify ruins into golden cities? Why do we retell stories of arrogance and collapse across cultures and centuries? Why does the desert seem to demand a legend as immense as Iram? These questions reveal that the City of the Pillars is not only an Arabian story, but a human one. It is about how we hold the past, how we give meaning to silence, and how we keep alive the warning that nothing built by pride can stand forever. The endurance of Iram as legend shows how deeply humans need stories that blend evidence and imagination. Across cultures, the most powerful myths are those that hover between what is seen and what is believed. Atlantis may never be located, but it has shaped philosophy and literature for 2,000 years. El Dorado was never a golden city in the jungles of South America, yet explorers risked their lives seeking it. Shangri-La, though fictional, is remembered as a symbol of hidden paradise. Iram belongs among these legends, but with one important difference. It is not only myth, it is scripture, tied to verses recited daily by millions, and it is archaeology, linked to ruins that can still be touched. This anchoring makes its endurance stronger than fantasy, for it carries moral, cultural, and historical weight all at once. In this way, Iram serves as a mirror of how memory works. The people who lived in the desert left behind shards of pottery, collapsed towers, and faint tracks pressed into the earth by caravans. On their own, these fragments might have been forgotten, but faith framed them as a story of pride and punishment, myth magnified them into a city of giants, and archaeology brought them into the language of science. Each layer preserved what the others might have lost. The desert swallowed the stones, but the story kept the city alive, ensuring it was never erased completely. This is why the search continues even today. Satellites trace caravan trails invisible to the naked eye. Drones scan dunes for patterns that might reveal buried foundations. Archaeologists sift through fragments in Oman and Yemen, piecing together the lives of traders and builders. Yet even if the exact ruins of Iram are never found, the story will remain. The search itself has become part of the legend, a modern continuation of the same impulse that drove Bedouins to tell tales of towers swallowed by sand. To look for Iram is to participate in the story, to affirm that some mysteries are worth seeking even when they resist solution. The coexistence of science, faith, and myth in Iram also shows us something about ourselves. We are drawn to the edge where certainty fades, where silence demands explanation. The Qur'an preserves Iram as a warning, archaeology preserves it as a puzzle, and myth preserves it as wonder. Each voice adds meaning, and together they remind us that history is never only about what happened. It is about how we remember and why we care. The fall of Iram may have been caused by storms, sinkholes, and shifting trade routes, but its survival in story comes from the human need to turn loss into lesson. And so Iram remains unsolved, not because evidence is lacking, but because its essence cannot be captured fully by evidence alone. The city of the pillars is larger than stones, larger than scripture alone, larger than story alone. It is the convergence of all three, a legend that carries the memory of ancient Arabia, the faith of millions, and the imagination of explorers and dreamers. In this convergence lies its power. The desert may guard its silence, but the story ensures that silence is never complete. In the end, Iram stands as proof that myths are not lies but vessels of meaning. They are how civilizations preserve what stones cannot hold. Whether or not the city is ever uncovered, it already endures in the ways that matter most, as warning, as wonder, and as witness to the fragility of pride. To walk in the empty quarter is to step into this convergence, where the wind carries echoes of giants, where ruins whisper of trade, and where verses remind that no tower stands forever. Iram may be lost in sand, but in faith, in science, and in myth, it is eternal. The Rub al Khali, the empty quarter, stretches across the Arabian Peninsula like an ocean of sand frozen in time. It is the largest continuous sand desert on Earth, covering more than 600,000 square kilometers, its dunes rising taller than cathedrals and rolling for distances that dwarf mountain ranges. For centuries it was a place of fear and fascination, a region so forbidding that Bedouins spoke of it in hushed tones. Few dared to cross it, and those who did often vanished, swallowed by thirst, shifting dunes, and silence. To explorers and storytellers alike, it seemed the most fitting place for a lost city to hide. If Iram had been buried, surely it lay here beneath sands that move endlessly with the wind. Early travelers brought back tales of mirages and phantom cities glimpsed at dawn. The Bedouins told of towers revealed when storms stripped the dunes, only to be buried again by the next wind. These stories fired the imagination of Western explorers in the 19th and early 20th centuries, who began to speak of the Atlantis of the sands. Yet the desert defied them. Expeditions struggled with extremes of heat, dunes that shifted like waves, and the impossibility of carrying enough water. Few penetrated far, and those who returned often brought only rumor. The empty quarter remained uncharted, a blank on maps, a stage set for mystery. In the late 20th century, technology began to turn that mystery into something more tangible. Satellites orbiting hundreds of kilometers above Earth scanned the desert with radar and infrared sensors. These instruments revealed what the human eye could not see: faint lines stretching across the dunes, the ghostly marks of caravan routes trodden by camels centuries ago. Some of these lines converged on known sites like Shiza in Oman, but others led deep into regions unexplored. To archaeologists, these were not just tracks, they were the fingerprints of human movement across a desert once believed empty. Ground-penetrating radar added another dimension, probing beneath the surface to detect foundations and collapsed structures. Drones equipped with high-resolution cameras flew low over dunes, tracing subtle depressions invisible from the ground. Artificial intelligence programs compared satellite images with historical records, modeling where settlements were most likely to exist. Slowly, the desert's silence began to yield patterns, a hidden map of human presence beneath the sand. What had long seemed void was revealed as a palimpsest of vanished rivers, forgotten camps, and lost towns. Archaeologists began expeditions guided not by guesswork but by data. They found fragments of pottery where caravan lines intersected, beads and tools where ancient wells once stood, and stone foundations at sites buried for centuries. Each discovery proved that the empty quarter was never truly empty. In wetter periods, rivers had crossed it, lakes had pooled in its basins, and people had lived along their banks. As climates shifted and the land dried, these communities moved or perished, leaving only fragments. Those fragments, magnified by legend, became the story of Iram. Yet the scale of the empty quarter is so vast that even with satellites and drones, much remains beyond reach. The desert covers an area so large that entire nations could disappear within it, and still its heart would be untouched. Archaeologists describe their work as racing against the desert itself, for each storm can erase months of progress, covering ruins that had just been revealed. The dunes move like tides, burying what was uncovered, uncovering what was buried, and always guarding the possibility that something extraordinary still lies hidden. It is this possibility that keeps the search alive. The ruins of Shaisar may be part of the story, but the desert's vastness suggests more. Perhaps other settlements await discovery, caravan forts long forgotten, or oasis towns swallowed when the climate shifted. Each shard of pottery, each track traced from orbit, each wall revealed by drones fuels the hope that one day the desert will yield a city worthy of the legend of Iram. For now, the sands keep their secret, whispering of what lies beneath. The modern expeditions into the empty quarter have revealed how fragile and resilient human memory can be when it confronts the desert. Teams equipped with the most advanced tools of archaeology travel to places that even in recent memory were thought unreachable. Helicopters drop scientists and equipment into basins between dunes, where drones are launched to scan the land. Ground teams carry sensitive instruments that can detect even the faintest anomalies beneath the sand. What they find is rarely dramatic at first glance: a scatter of pottery fragments, a line of stones half buried, a depression where a well once stood. Yet each small fragment is part of a larger story that confirms what the Qur'an and Bedouin tales have always suggested. The desert was once alive with people and trade. Some discoveries hint that the legend of Iram may have sprung not from a single city, but from many settlements whose memory blended together. Archaeologists studying caravan routes note that they were dotted with forts, wells, and markets every few days' journey. Each of these could have been remembered as a place of prosperity and towers. Over centuries, as they were abandoned and buried, their names faded, leaving only one great city in memory, a composite of many. Iram may therefore be not one place, but a symbol for an entire vanished world of desert kingdoms. The work of climate scientists supports this view. Studies of sediment cores and fossilized pollen show that Arabia experienced wetter periods thousands of years ago, when rivers ran through what is now barren desert. In those times, lakes formed in the basins of the empty quarter, attracting herders and traders. When the climate shifted, the lakes dried, the rivers vanished, and the land hardened into dunes. Communities that once thrived here were forced to leave, and their towns became ghosts. In this slow transformation, myth found its foundation. A settlement destroyed by drought became a city destroyed by storm. A tower swallowed by a sinkhole became a metropolis erased in an instant. The desert itself reinforces these myths by the way it conceals and reveals. A sandstorm can cover a wall that has stood for centuries, then, years later, uncover it again, Travelers in the 19th century spoke of seeing ruins that later expeditions could not find, not because the travelers lied, but because the desert had buried them anew. This shifting visibility lends truth to the Bedouin stories of phantom cities, towers glimpsed at dawn before vanishing like mirages. The sands are not only a destroyer but a storyteller, revealing fragments at moments that feed the imagination. The role of technology has changed the scale of this search, but it has not changed its essence. The satellites that trace caravan trails are the modern version of the Bedouin guide who followed faint hoofprints. The drones that peer beneath dunes are the successors to explorers who scanned horizons with binoculars. The tools are sharper, but the motivation is the same. The conviction that the desert holds secrets and that those secrets are worth pursuing. Each new shard or track fuels the idea that something larger waits to be uncovered, perhaps even a city that will match the legend of Iram. For the people of Arabia, these discoveries are more than archaeology. They are connections to an ancestral past, proof that their lands were once centers of wealth and exchange, not merely barren sands. To uncover a caravan fort is to reclaim a fragment of history that links local memory to global trade. To trace a dried river is to see how the land once nourished life. In this way, the search for Iram is not only about solving a mystery, but about restoring a narrative of Arabia as a place where civilizations thrived long before oil reshaped the desert. The desert, however, continues to resist full revelation. Even the most sophisticated tools cannot scan every dune, and even the most determined expeditions can only probe small sections of a vast wilderness. The empty quarter remains a guardian of silence, giving away pieces of its story but never the whole. This resistance is part of why the legend of Iram has survived so powerfully. If the city were uncovered completely, it might lose some of its mystery, but as long as the sands conceal as much as they reveal, the story remains alive, balanced between discovery and imagination. The quest for Iram has become as much about imagination as it is about archaeology. Each new expedition into the Rub al Khali is driven not only by science, but also by the desire to touch a story that has survived across millennia. Scholars may carefully phrase their findings in terms of pottery assemblages and collapsed architecture, but the headlines that follow almost always speak of the lost city of the pillars. The public hungers for the Atlantis of the sands, a desert counterpart to Plato's island, and in that hunger the myth continues to shape the meaning of every discovery. This blending of legend and science is not deception, but testimony to how human memory functions. We look at the faint lines of caravan trails traced from orbit and see not just tracks, but processions of camels stretching to the horizon. We look at a scatter of beads in the sand and imagine the wealth of incense and silk exchanged beneath desert skies. We look at a collapsed tower and see arrogance undone by storm. Archaeology provides the fragments, but myth weaves them into a fabric that satisfies the imagination. The sands themselves seem to conspire in this process, giving just enough evidence to keep the story alive, never enough to silence it. For those who live on the edges of the empty quarter, the legend of Iram is not merely academic, it is part of identity. The Bedouin tales of towers swallowed by dunes affirm a deep connection between people and land, reminding them that the desert has always been both sustainer and destroyer. To believe that their ancestors built cities in the desert is to know that survival here has always required greatness, whether of strength, ingenuity, or humility. The Qur'an's warning that pride leads to downfall resonates with the daily reality of life in such a harsh environment, where water and shade are fragile blessings. For explorers and scientists from outside the region, the appeal lies in the mystery itself. The empty quarter is one of the last frontiers on Earth, a place where entire histories may still be buried, awaiting discovery. Each expedition is framed not only as research but as adventure, a confrontation with one of the planet's most extreme landscapes. To search for Iram is to stand at the intersection of myth and method, where GPS coordinates and radar scans share space with tales of giants and storms. Few other quests capture so perfectly the human impulse to seek meaning in silence. And yet, even as the tools grow sharper, there is an unspoken recognition that the desert may never yield a final answer. Perhaps Iram was Shissa, the collapsed fortress in Oman. Perhaps it lies still beneath dunes no one has yet scanned. Or perhaps it was never a single place at all, but a name for the collective memory of many settlements lost to time. The legend does not require resolution, for its power lies in ambiguity. A fully explained Iram would be less compelling than the Iram that hovers between fact and myth, always just beyond certainty. The empty quarter itself seems to guard this ambiguity with patience. Dunes shift, rivers vanish, winds erase footprints in moments. What was visible yesterday may be gone tomorrow. The desert teaches impermanence, and Iram is its greatest lesson. Whether city or story, it is preserved not by stones alone, but by the human need to remember what pride builds and time destroys. The sands ensure that the city of the pillars will always remain partly hidden, partly revealed, never entirely captured. In this way, the search for Iram is eternal. It is not a problem to be solved once and for all, but a reminder of the fragile line between history and legend. To seek Iram is to accept that truth can exist in fragments, that meaning can live in silence, and that some mysteries endure because they are never fully answered. The empty quarter will go on whispering, its dunes shifting like waves, its towers glimpsed only in imagination. And Iram will go on standing in that space between certainty and story, a city that endures precisely because it remains just beyond our reach. The story of Iram begins in the Qur'an, moves through the folklore of the Bedouin, and continues in the language of archaeology and exploration. Yet it does not end in any of these places. The city of the pillars lives on not because its ruins have been confirmed beyond doubt, but because it has become more than a city. It is a mirror held up to human ambition, a lesson carved into scripture, a mystery that draws explorers into one of the harshest deserts on Earth. In this sense, Iram has already achieved immortality. It is the eternal city of giants, surviving in memory even if it has vanished in stone. For many, the ruins at Qusur in Oman are proof enough. The collapsed tower, the pottery shards, and the caravan tracks converging on the site all tell of a settlement that flourished when incense trade reached its height. The geology explains its fall. The fortress built over a limestone cavern collapsed when the ground beneath gave way. Science and archaeology offer a clear picture of a community undone by natural processes and economic decline. But to reduce Iram to Qusur alone is to miss its larger significance. The story in scripture is not simply about geology, but about arrogance. The tale told by Bedouins is not only about caravans, but about giants. And the fascination of explorers is not only about trade routes, but about the universal desire to find what is lost. This is why Iram endures even if no final proof is ever found. It has been adopted into the global imagination, compared to Atlantis, El Dorado, and Troy. Each of these places speaks of human pride, sudden collapse, and the mystery of ruins half hidden by time. Iram is unique, however, because it belongs equally to faith, archaeology, and myth. It is revelation, history, and story all at once. Even without golden towers rising from the desert, it continues to inspire because it exists in the imagination as a city that must have been. Its absence in the landscape has only made its presence in memory stronger. The giants of the desert remain central to this endurance. In Bedouin tales, they were beings taller than palm trees, builders of pillars that touched the sky. In Quranic verses, they were people of immense strength who turned their gift into arrogance. In modern interpretations, they are symbols of ambition exaggerated into myth. Whether taken literally or metaphorically, the giants keep the story alive by embodying its lesson. They remind us that greatness without humility collapses, whether by storm, sinkhole, or silence. Their shadow stretches across centuries, as vivid today as when the story was first recited. What gives the legend of Iram its eternal power is not certainty, but ambiguity. If archaeologists had uncovered a fully preserved city with inscriptions naming it Iram, the mystery would be closed. The city would join the catalogue of ancient sites, explained, catalogued, and visited. But because Iram remains elusive, half revealed in ruins and half preserved in story, it continues to live. The desert refuses to give a final answer, and so imagination continues to wander. In this way, the silence of the empty quarter sustains the city more effectively than ruins ever could. Iram's immortality is therefore not in stone, but in meaning. It is remembered because it warns, because it fascinates, because it connects the past with the present. The people of Arabia look to it as part of their heritage, explorers look to it as a mystery to solve, and the world at large looks to it as a symbol of how civilizations rise and fall. Its pillars may be buried, but in story they still stand, tall against the horizon of memory. The endurance of Iram as legend has shaped not only the imagination of explorers, but also the cultural identity of Arabia itself. For centuries, the Arabian Peninsula was described by outsiders as a barren land, a place of endless sand and nomadic tribes. The rediscovery of its ancient past, kingdoms of incense, cities of stone, civilizations that traded with Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Rome, reshaped that perception. Iram, whether real or symbolic, came to embody this hidden grandeur. It served as proof that Arabia had once been not a periphery but a center, a land where wealth and power flourished before vanishing into silence. For those who live on its edges today, the story of Iram is both pride and warning, a reminder that their ancestors walked a landscape richer than the desert now suggests. This sense of pride was amplified by the way Western explorers embraced the story. To them, Iram became the Atlantis of the sands, a counterpart to Plato's drowned island. Lawrence of Arabia spoke of it with fascination, framing it as a desert mystery waiting to be solved. Newspapers repeated the name with excitement, attaching it to every rumor of ruins seen in the empty quarter. In Europe and America, the idea of a city swallowed by sand resonated with deep cultural archetypes of loss and pride. By placing Iram alongside Atlantis and El Dorado, Western audiences ensured it would never be forgotten, even if archaeology never produced definitive proof. Yet the comparison to Atlantis also reveals something deeper about human memory. Both stories warn of civilizations undone by arrogance. Both describe grandeur erased in an instant. Both hover between history and allegory, never fully confirmed, never fully dismissed. This ambiguity is what keeps them alive. A city fully found is a city explained, but a city half found is eternal. Iram survives because the desert keeps part of its story hidden, leaving space for imagination to wander. The sands guard not only ruins but possibility, and possibility is the soil in which legends thrive. The legend of Iram also reminds us that myths are not falsehoods, but vessels of truth carried across generations. The people of Ad may not have been giants in the literal sense, but their memory survived as giants because their strength seemed immense compared to later tribes. The storm that swept them away may have been drought or shifting trade routes, yet memory preserved it as a wind that howled for 7 nights and 8 days. The exaggeration was not meant to deceive, but to magnify, ensuring the lesson was not forgotten. In this way, myth preserved the essence of truth when details were lost. Modern archaeology confirms that many settlements once thrived in Arabia and then vanished. Some collapsed into sinkholes, others were abandoned when trade routes shifted to the sea. Others were swallowed by sand as the climate dried. Each of these collapses left fragments, and together they may have formed the composite memory of Iram. To say that Iram was never one city is not to deny its existence, but to recognize its power as symbol. It embodies the fate of many lost towns, condensed into one enduring name. That is why it has outlasted them all. The ambiguity of Iram gives it timeless relevance. For the believer, it is a sign of divine justice. For the archaeologist, it is an unsolved mystery. For the storyteller, it is an endless source of wonder. Each perspective adds to its life. Each ensures that the city of the pillars stands not only in stone but in memory. It is not diminished by uncertainty. On the contrary, uncertainty ensures that it can be retold in every generation, adapted to new questions, new discoveries, and new imaginations. In this sense, the eternal city of giants is not simply about the past, it is about the present and the future. It warns us that pride is fragile, that civilizations built on wealth can collapse when trade shifts or climates change. It inspires us to search, to probe the sands with satellites and drones, to walk the dunes in hope of discovery. And it reminds us that some mysteries endure because they cannot be closed. The desert still whispers, the dunes still shift, and Iram still waits, half revealed, half imagined, forever standing in the silence of the empty quarter. The desert holds the last word in the story of Iram. To stand on the edge of the Rub al Khali is to look across a horizon without end, dunes rising and falling like waves on a frozen sea. The wind carries no voices, yet within its silence there is memory. For centuries, travelers have sworn they saw shapes in the distance, pillars revealed by shifting sands at dawn before vanishing again like mirages. Bedouin tales speak of bones larger than any living man uncovered by storms, of wells that once gave water but now lie buried under mountains of sand. These stories may never be verified by archaeologists, yet they endure because they capture what the desert itself seems to say, that it guards something vast and forgotten. In the imagination, Iram has never been buried completely. Its towers stand as firmly in story as they ever could in stone. In the Qur'an, they remain a warning, their fall a lesson about arrogance and divine justice. In archaeology, they are sought in ruins and tracks, shards and collapsed caverns. In folklore, they belong to the giants, reminders that greatness can be undone in a single breath of wind. Together, these voices ensure that Iram endures not only as history but as meaning. Even if its stones are never uncovered, it is alive wherever it is remembered. What makes Iram eternal is the way it belongs to every perspective. It is revelation for those who believe, mystery for those who search, and wonder for those who tell stories. Few cities hold such a place. Babylon lies in ruins, Troy has been excavated, Petra is carved in red stone for all to see. But Iram remains elusive, half visible, always receding into the desert as soon as one approaches. That elusiveness is its strength. It ensures that the city of the pillars is never reduced to a single explanation. It can be at once a warning from heaven, an archaeological puzzle, and a myth of giants without contradiction. In this way, the legend of Iram stretches beyond Arabia. It becomes part of the universal human story about pride, loss, and memory. Every civilization has its ruins, every people its warnings, every desert or ocean its legends. Iram speaks to them all, reminding us that even the greatest towers stand on fragile ground. The giants of the desert walk beside the giants of other traditions, the Nephilim of the Bible, the Titans of Greece, the forgotten kings of Mesopotamia. Each of them embodies the same truth: strength without humility collapses. As the 20th and 21st centuries brought satellites, drones, and ground-penetrating radar, many believed the sands would finally yield their secret. And indeed, they revealed caravan routes, ancient wells, and collapsed forts. But the full city of the pillars remained hidden. Each discovery fueled imagination rather than silenced it. The more that was uncovered, the more the mystery deepened. It is as if the desert insists that Iram remain not only an object of archaeology but a living story. Its survival depends on never being fully solved. In the end, this is the lesson of the eternal city of giants. Some mysteries endure because they belong not to the earth alone, but to the imagination. Iram may have been a caravan town, a fortress swallowed by a sinkhole, or a memory of many settlements woven into one name. But it has become something larger. It has become the mirror of human pride, the echo of civilizations undone, the voice of the desert itself whispering that nothing lasts forever. That is why it is eternal. And so the story closes in silence. The wind shifts across dunes that move like waves, burying and uncovering in endless rhythm. Perhaps beneath them towers once stood, perhaps they still stand, waiting. Perhaps they exist only in memory. But in faith, in archaeology, and in story, Iram endures. The city of the pillars remains, half found and half imagined, forever the Atlantis of the sands, the eternal city of giants.